Probably two of the most iconic bass styles ever created, the Fender P and the Fender J, precision and the jazz bass. Today we're going to talk about how they're different, and which one may be more suited for you. Stick around. Hello everybody, this is Carlos Jimenez here with Alamo Music Center in beautiful downtown San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our videos, and follow us for notifications so that way you can get all the latest updates on all the amazing content we're going to be releasing for you. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking today about the Fender P precision bass as well as also the Fender J jazz bass. These are possibly two of the most iconic, if not the most iconic basses ever created. This one right here in my hand is actually the precision bass. And well, being perfectly honest, this right here is what you can thank for possibly one of the biggest revolutions in modern music history and probably popular culture in general. So the Fender P bass, before we get into how they differ from the J's, let's go a little bit into some detail about it. So the P bass, the precision bass, is actually the one that came first of the two between the precision and the jazz. And this was originally released in 1951 as a way to kind of mitigate the problems that arose from double bass. Now, have you ever heard of a double bass, or if you're not familiar with it, it's an extremely, extremely beautiful instrument, and I personally wish that I knew how to play one better than I do. But for as beautiful as it is, as iconic as the instrument in and of itself is, it has some drawbacks. Predominantly how really, really big it is. So a double bass is way huger than what I have here, probably huger than I am if I stand up, and that in and of itself can create some problems. Not just the fact that it's more physically demanding, but we also have to factor in transport. When you're moving it, this isn't like a drum set. You know, a drum set can take up a lot of real estate on stage, but once we're talking about putting it away, putting it in the van, putting up so that we can go on to the next location, you have the ability to compartmentalize those things and maybe move them as needed to fit in the car. A double bass, you put it in a case that's bigger than the bass itself, and then you're pretty much like the Rubik, like when you're playing Tetris, the little one bar, that's it. You just have this huge space that you now have to occupy. So in addition to those things of size and physical labor, the thing you also have to factor in is that the majority of double basses are not going to be built in some sort of hybrid model where we have a double bass that's also an electric at the same time. It's typically going to be straight acoustic, which means that that does create some issues, especially at the time when we're playing with either amplified bands or if there's more instruments involved in terms of getting that double bass to break through the mix. And if you've ever seen a double bass, unlike a regular electric bass guitar, which as you can see, shares a lot of similarities with a regular guitar, double bass does not. Double bass requires a specialized set of skills that does not translate from guitar or vice versa. So that's where the precision bass comes into play. That precision directly refers to the fact that we are talking about a fretted bass. We're not talking about how a double bass has no frets and a limited scale. This allowed you at that point to be able to play a little bit more in tune easier. You know, if you were good on the double bass, you didn't have to worry about being in tune or not in tune. You knew where to put your fingers in order to be able to get the tones as you needed them. This right here, however, made it even easier, emulating what was already found on guitars to make it that much more simpler. Now, the P bass in general was not super popular coming off the top. It took a little while for it to finally get into transition. Double bass players did not want to go to a P bass. Eventually, though, over time, it did start catching on to the point where like I said, it revolutionized modern music, possibly even popular culture as we know it. Now, this right here was 1951 it drops. So let's fast forward a bit. Let's go into about 1959. It's been 8 years. Fender has dropped the P bass. They have currently available on the guitar model Stratocasters, Telecasters, Jazzmasters, but still just a precision bass. So around this time is when Fender decided that he wanted to create a deluxe edition of the P bass, Fender P bass Deluxe, and he akined it to kind of like cars. When they create a car, they always create the regular car, then the deluxe car edition, you know, the Cadillac, and that was his intention around 59. Going into the turn of the decade, into the 60s, that's when focus shifted. The same way that the Stratocaster added more of a variety and more of a supplementation on the guitar side to what the Telecaster was offering, Fender and his team decided that they should do the same with the P bass. And so those designs that were originally going to be the P bass Deluxe ended up being rekindled and readjusted to be the jazz bass that we know now. Both of these basses were a little different from their original inception, but it wasn't that long before they finally took on the iconic design that we know today and that have honestly lasted for the last 60 some odd years. So let's go ahead and discuss the differences here. So when you're looking at a jazz bass and a P bass, there's some immediate differences that you can immediately see just right off the bat. So for starters, some of the biggest things you can tell, body size. We're looking at the body shape. Right here, the precision bass is more modeled on like the Stratocaster, while the jazz bass is more modeled on a Jazz Master style. This, of course, is not the only differences that we see here. As you can clearly see, there's also a difference in the way the pickups are, where we're talking about a split coil system versus a dual single coil system, as in the way that we have it on the Jazz. And of course, even the knobs. Now the knobs, as you can see, we're only looking at 2 versus 3. Why is that? We're talking about volume and tone versus 2 different volume controls for your neck and your bridge, as well as also a master tone. Now it's not really super easy to see. I'm not sure how well you may be able to see it just on camera, but the necks as well also have a different taper. I'm talking about right here at the very tip. We're talking about 38 versus 44. So these are just immediately visible. Just by looking at them, for the most part, you can already tell. But how does this translate to what you can't see? So let's break these down piece by piece. So as I mentioned originally, these two have very different body types. Now, the body type in and of itself may not play a major factor in terms of the tone that you might get out of it, but the comfortability is definitely going to be affected greatly. With the jazz bass being more based on the Jazz Master, the picking hand is actually taken a little bit further away from the strings, meaning there's a bigger gap between where the strings are right here and the end. Now, that in and of itself, like for people like me, can create a little bit more comfort. I personally prefer that bigger size distance because it makes me feel like I'm a little bit more connected to the bass myself. Some people, however, don't like that big body going up to their arm, which is why the P bass in that shape can be very more comfortable. Now, in addition to that, that's just right now we're just talking aesthetics and how that comes to playability, but every single factor that I mentioned does play a difference in regards to what you're going to be getting out of the experience of playing both of these. Moving on to the next thing, when we're talking about the split coil system versus 2 single coils. While it may seem very comparable, we're talking about what looks like 2 different single coil pickups, the positioning, as well as also the size and the build, play a very drastic impact on what you're going to hear from these. Typically with a P bass, you're going to be getting what is pretty much a classic solid bass tone, just pretty much what you expect a standardized bass tone to kind of sound. With the jazz bass, you're going to get a little bit more of a cleaner tone, as some would say, and has a little bit more of a mids to it. Now, with the tone, with this, you think about Black Sabbath, your rock and roll, your Iron Maiden, and this, think about more of like sometimes the jazz, the rock, or the blues. That's going to be some of the more, well, mindful that these can work across any genre whatsoever. That is where more traditionally you see them kind of take their routes. But again, it is important to note both of these have done every single genre across the last 60 some odd years of their existence. So as we move on, now we start talking about those pickups, right? So what does that mean in terms of these controls we got here? So we have a 1 volume, 1 tone versus 2 volume and 2 tones. So what is that? So with the 2 volume and tone that we have on the jazz bass here, top one's going to control your neck while the bottom one's going to control your bridge, and the ultimate one down there is going to be a master tone volume. That compared to just the tone and volume means that with the jazz bass, you do have the ability to create a lot more of a sculpting and a lot more honed in tone than what you might be able to immediately get out of a precision bass. Doesn't necessarily mean that the tone itself is going to make it better in that sense because you can hone it in, but if you do like that flexibility of being able to maybe sculpt the sound to more akin to what you'd like, you'll find that a little bit more easier on the jazz bass and on the P bass. And then lastly, as I mentioned, that taper in the neck. So what does that mean for you when you're playing it? Well, typically, when we've got a skinnier neck, skinnier taper, that's usually what's going to translate to what's called faster. The ability to feel like you can get more complex lines. Now, that does come with a drawback, in the sense that because the neck is a little bit fatter on the P bass, does allow it the opportunity to have a lot more of a meatier tone. And sometimes, depending on where you are in the mix, what you're trying to do, what genre you're really trying to play, one can be better over the other. So first we're going to demo out the P bass, then we're going to demo out the jazz bass so you can hear the immediate differences between the two, and then talk about what we get from them. So as you can hear, there is a drastic difference between what a P bass sounds like and what a jazz bass sounds like. And I do want to note that I didn't do any sculpting on either of these. I pretty much just left them where both the volume knobs and the tone knobs are pretty much just maxed out all the way up, so that way it can kind of give us as close to a comparable tone of one another as it can in terms of what you're getting as the bass tone of these two. Now, when you hear those two right now, it may not be immediately visible to yourself which one exactly you want. So there's a few things to consider that it's very important to note. There is no wrong choice here. There is no wrong choice. I really do want to stress that the P bass and the jazz bass throughout their entire lives have been used across all forms of genres. Across all forms. On the P bass side, you have famous acts like Pink Floyd's Roger Waters. You have Dee Dee Ramone from the Ramones. You have Steve Harris from Iron Maiden. All these guys, we're talking about psychedelic, punk rock, British heavy metal, all of them found within the P bass. Jazz bass, we're talking about Jaco Pastorius, we're talking about Geddy Lee from Rush, we're talking about Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, we're talking about probably one of the most iconic jazz players of all time, one of the most iconic experimental players of all time, and then one of the more modern, bigger funk. So we're talking about funk, experimental, jazz. Three genres that don't have really any major connection to one another, but yet the jazz bass has found a home in all three. The P bass, we're talking about psychedelic, punk rock, British heavy metal, three genres that aren't 100% tied to each other, but yet the P bass has found itself home in all three. And that's across the board. So when it comes down to P versus J, you don't want to, the precision versus jazz, you don't want to look at it as which one's better, because truthfully, there isn't one. If you were told this is the best precision bass of all time, this is the best jazz of all time, you're only allowed to pick one and you can play for the rest of your life and that is it, nothing else. You really could honestly pick either one of the two and make it work anything you're trying to play. When it comes down to precision versus jazz, it really comes down to the look and the feel and the sound. Those the two basic things. If you prefer just even the look of the precision bass over the jazz bass, that reason is more than enough alone to buy precision over a jazz. If you like the way that it sounds, that's an even better one, but really there is no wrong choice. The best thing that I would suggest when it comes down to P versus jazz is really to play them. Just go down to your local store. If you have the ability to come down to Alamo Music Center, come down to Alamo Music Center, check them out in person, see which one feels more comfortable in your hands. Because ultimately, there is no wrong answer here. I really, really, really want to stress that. And it's going to come down one more time to the look, the feel, and the sound that you want. So if you can, go down to your local music shop and actually test them out. Come down to Alamo Music Center if you have the ability, test them out here, or even go to alamomusic.com and you can chat with us if you have any questions about them. But the Fender Jazz and the Fender Precision or Squire, what have you, they are the two most iconic basses that have ever been created for a reason. So regardless of which one you feel is better, just know that you aren't picking anything wrong. You are picking the right bass for you, and that is the most important bass of all. So from what we talked about today, so we got clearly the jazz and the precision. There's a lot of differences, not just in the way that they're built, but in the way that they sound. But the most important thing that I'm gonna keep repeating over and over again, because I need to stress it to y'all, there is not a single wrong choice. Comes down to playability, comes down to looks, comes down to the sound. The ones that you like. Can I tell you right now, I love giving all this information about the P and the J, but you can watch this video for hours on end, you can watch related video for hours on end, but nothing's gonna beat actually holding it in your hand and seeing which one feels like it's an extension of who you are. So hopefully you learned a little something about what the precision bass is versus what the jazz bass is, and maybe it gave you a little bit more idea of where you fall in that spectrum. But regardless of where it is, remember that best instrument is the one that you find the most comfortable for you, and it's the one that helps you progress your musical journey the best. If you have any other questions, one more time, reach out to us through alamomusic.com. We are always there available to chat. You can also comment below, let us know any questions or opinions you have about the precision bass. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so very much for letting me be a part of the Alamo Music family. And I really hope you have a great rest of your day.